Hey, it's Sela Social Studies.
Hey guys, welcome back to Cesar Social Studies. All right, the last part of this chapter 28 in your book, The Civil Rights Movement, the Modern Civil Rights Movement, the last part we're going to focus on are other minority groups besides African Americans who are fighting for civil rights during the 50s, 60s, into the 70s, right? So we have these groups of people who are looking and they're like, wow, these African Americans, they're really making strides in civil rights. We should go ahead and start doing them too. So here we go. Let's start getting into it, okay? The first one we're going to talk about here is Latinos, right? Hispanic American groups start fighting for civil rights. They see that African Americans are succeeding, and they said, now, this is our time too. Now, so look at some of the numbers here. Americans' Hispanic population is growing, and it's growing today. But when you look at down here in the 1960s and 70s, you have in 1960, there was only 4 million Hispanic Americans in the United States. And by 1970, it more than doubled to 10 million. And we're actually on pace right now to have Hispanic Americans be the majority in the United States. And I don't remember what the exact year was, but 2030, 2040, 2050, somewhere around there, because of the large population growth of Hispanic Americans. Now they have diverse origins. You're talking about Mexico, Puerto Rico, Cuba, other Latin American countries with people immigrating into the United States. You actually have places like Little Havana down in Miami, right, where everything is in Spanish, even though in the United States our main language is English. But you go down to Little Havana and there everything is in Spanish. All the billboards, the signs on the highway, everything is in Spanish because of the such highly populated Hispanic American culture down there. All right, so this, like I said, the success of African American civil rights movements really encouraged Hispanic Americans to fight for their own rights. And one man in particular took the Hispanic American civil rights movement and placed it on his shoulders. And Cesar Chavez was the Hispanic American that took this all on his shoulders. He formed a union in 1962 that would later become the United Farm Workers Union. So now you have Hispanic Americans who are forming their own unions. And now when you're talking about Hispanic Americans during the 1960s, you're talking about predominantly in the southwestern part of the United States, in the western. Now, yes, we do have the pockets of Puerto Ricans and Cubans down in Florida, as well as up in New York City. You have large factions of Puerto Ricans up there. But when we're talking about this time, the Hispanic American time, mostly we're talking about the Mexican Americans out in the Southwest and in California. Chavez was committed to the goal of better pay and working conditions for migrant farm workers, these immigrants that came over and did a lot of the farming in the Southwest, specifically grape growers, right? He led the UFW in a 5-year strike and boycott against California grape growers. And as a result of this boycott, he won better wages and benefits for these farmers in 1970. So what Chavez was doing was working. And wait till you hear some of the things that Chavez actually did to make it work. Chavez was like king. He believed in civil disobedience, nonviolent protest. He inspired young leaders in the Chicano movement. His work impacted new legislation. Okay, what things that Chavez did was he would go on hunger strikes. And I'll touch on that. I'm not sure if it's this one or the next one, but we'll go ahead and touch on it in a second. He had an amendment in 1968. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act required schools to teach students whose first language was not English in both languages until English was learned. Because how can you expect it to be fair for a person to come over here from Mexico or Puerto Rico or Cuba, anywhere, and start going to school where the primary language is English, but you don't learn in English? Think about if you were just picked up and brought over to, heck, France, and dropped down and said, all right, go to French high school and see how you do. So now we're talking about incorporating them more into school as well to be able to teach them. And they also passed, now look at the date here, 1975. That might be long for you, because you might not have been born, but it's kind of like right around the corner here. Voting Rights Act of 1975 required communities with large immigrant populations to print the ballots in their preferred language. So you have a ballot where you can't read it. You're just like checking off names. Now, of course, they do it on the computer, but hey, I don't know who this guy, I don't know. Right? So now they finally got it to where they had it in their own language. All right, so I skipped over this and I don't know why, but Chavez would do things like go on hunger strikes. He would sit there and not eat for 2-3 weeks at a time, and these hunger strikes would gather the nation, their eyes all focused on Chavez. Wow, what's this guy doing? Well, this guy is doing hunger strikes. I don't know if I have it on here either. That's women. No. All right. So he would do hunger strikes, big hunger strikes. I'm talking 2, 3, up to 4 weeks without eating. Of course, you have to have, you have to have water and you have to have some vitamins and stuff like that. And he was safe. He had, paramedics and doctors are checking him out, but he would do these hunger strikes to bring attention to his cause. All right. And this is why Chavez was able to get a lot of things done. All right. We've already gave you a sneak peek here. Women began fighting for equal rights too. If you remember correctly, women could not vote until 1920. Right, with the passing of the 19th Amendment. So now you have women fighting for a lot of other things too. Activists brought attention to women's position in society. If you remember the post-World War II society, women were told to give up their jobs, become housewives, and really love their refrigerators and washers and dryers, right? So in 1963, a government commission reported fewer job opportunities and lower pay for women. This is something that's still fighting about now, lower pay and equal positions. Legislation was passed to help equalize rights, and in 1963, the Equal Pay Act required many employers to pay men and women equal salaries for the same work. That's some employers to pay men and women for the same salary for same work. Still not all. The Civil Rights Act of 64 banned discrimination based on gender and race. So gender. So now somebody can't say, I can't hire you because you're a woman. Right? So women began questioning these traditional roles that they were kind of placed into post-World War II. The women's movement worked for equal rights. Author Betty Friedan became a leader of women's rights movement, and she wrote a book called The Feminine Mystique. And she asked the question in the book, is this all there is for a woman? Right? Is this all there is? I can't do something like become a doctor, a chemist, a biologist. I can't do something. I can't work up in the business world. I have to be a housewife. So Friedan helped form the National Organization of Women. Right now, the National Organization for Women, founded in 1966, fought for things like equal rights, like the Equal Rights Amendment. There's a picture right there. Equality. The time is now. National Organization for Women, NOW. They demanded equal pay for equal work, pressured the government to support and enforce legislations that prohibited gender discrimination. Now, you would think that now, NOW, the National Organization for Women, was able to gather all the women together and fight for this. Now, they did. Look at the side of the screen right there. You have on the top ERA. Yes, you have a lot of women in that picture holding signs. But on the bottom right, you have somebody who wants to stop the ERA. All right. And the ERA is the Equal Rights Amendment, right? The Equal Rights Amendment was to outlaw discrimination based on sex. Conservative activists like Phyllis Schlafly worked to stop it. And through initially approved by Congress, it never got ratified. So think about this for a minute. So you have women fighting for their rights. They want to outlaw discrimination based on sex. They want, equal pay and equal rights and equal work. But you have women who are fighting against it, who are okay with the traditional roles. And ultimately, it's kind of like women was kind of like the brakes on the ERA, on the Equal Rights Amendment. And still, as of this video today in 2020, the Equal Rights Amendment still has not been passed. Despite the failure of the ERA, women's movement achieved many goals. There were new opportunities of education in the workplace, going to college and becoming biologists and chemists and stuff like that. And they started winning political offices at all levels. Now, remember, we have not had a woman president yet, but Hillary Clinton was the Democratic nominee for the president of the United States. Okay, so we have congresswomen, we have senators who are women. In the House of Representatives, we have women. So they are winning more political offices. They have not reached the highest one as of yet. Okay, other people fighting for their rights. Native Americans fought for their civil equal rights. They had the National Congress of American Indians helped win passage of the Indian Civil Rights Movement in 1968. American Indian Movement, right? Remember Wounded Knee. This allowed tribes to gain more control over the reservation lands. The American Indian Movement, founded in 1968 to fight for rights. Protests were organized for some, which ended in violence. Remember what we said, whenever there's protests, most of the time they end in violence. And the last one that we're going to cover here in this chapter are the disabled. The disabled began to fight for their rights. And look at this date right here, right? These dates, 1970s. This is not that long ago, guys, that people are actually earning their civil rights. The civil rights movement did not happen long ago. This is why we have lots of information. We have lots of pictures, right? We could see the pictures of the people getting their stuff dumped on their head and marching for their rights, because this is still this generation that's around right now. Generations, your grandparents, parents, whatever it might be, have gone through the civil rights movement. They've been there. They know it. They've seen it. It was on TV. It was on the radio. They know all about it. This is why we know so much. And this is not that long ago. 50 years right here, right? So disabled began to fight for their rights, and in 1970, Disabled in Action was created to raise awareness of challenges of people facing with disabilities and work for legislation. The Rehabilitation Act in 1973 is passed. The Education of Handicapped Children in 1975 is passed. Now look at this bottom date. This will blow your mind. The Americans with Disabilities Act passes in 1990, and it outlawed discrimination against people with disabilities. So businesses were able to discriminate people with disabilities all the way up until 1990. I'm sorry, I can't hire you because you have a disability. You can't come to the school because you have a disability. Finally, in 1990, the ADA comes around and is able to outlaw the discrimination against people with disabilities. So during the 1950s and 60s, you have African Americans predominantly fighting for their rights. But once they get that train moving, that ball moving, you have other people who are going to jump on that train, and they're going to go ahead and fight and win lots of rights too. We covered Hispanic Americans, women, the disabled, the Native Americans. So you really have the 1950s and 1960s is really dominated by civil rights.